Beverly McLachlin, Canada's former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is widely considered to be one of our country's finest legal minds. Not only is she Canada's longest serving Chief Justice, but she's also the first woman to hold the position. However, some very high profile figures have argued that Miss McLachlin is tarnishing her legacy by remaining as a non permanent judge on the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. Joining us now to explain the opposition to Miss McLachlin's position on the Hong Kong court is Peter MacKay, strategic advisor at Deloitte, as well as former Canadian Attorney General, Justice Minister, Foreign Affairs Minister, and Defense Minister. Peter, thank you very much for joining us on Forum Daily.
My pleasure, David.
Why is it problematic for Miss McLachlin to serve on Hong Kong's Final Court of Appeal?
Well, I think you have to look at it in the context of the deterioration of the judicial system, the entire legal system in Hong Kong, going back to the turnover of control from Great Britain to China. And it has been a steady and I would argue accelerated decline in the independence of their judicial system, resulting in the resignation of several from the UK judges that were on this non-permanent Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. And it, in the larger context, is about human rights. It's about the authoritarian, bordering on totalitarian regime in China, and Beijing and the Communist Party of China interfering in the system. This is what the concern is for those who watch these areas closely. And by being part of that Court of Final Appeal and allowing this deterioration to happen, which is really beyond the control of the judges, having your name associated with it, being a participant in that court, really, as you said, tarnishes the reputation of the court, tarnishes the reputation of the participants, including Justice McLachlin, and by extension, our own system.
Yeah, you've said that it tarnishes her legacy and gives the court, the Hong Kong court, legitimacy that it maybe shouldn't have. She says that the court is still independent. What do you make of her defense?
Well, I think that's quite weak when you consider what has happened already and what continues to play out, including a quite infamous case involving a gentleman named Jimmy Lai, who is from Great Britain, is a journalist, is an activist, a publisher. He has been brought before the court on very specious charges that come from a new national security law that was passed without real consultation or due process. And so Justice McLachlin's response to these concerns, I believe, is quite weak. She even went so far as to say that the court has a terrific record working within the law. Well, yes, that may be so, but their laws certainly don't measure up to any sort of Western standard, let alone any sort of independent standard that doesn't allow the government, the regime of China, to interfere in that process, which there is evidence is occurring.
Yeah, and specifically for that role in the final court of appeal, we know that many pro-democracy advocates have been tried, convicted, and served prison time, and have since sought refuge in countries like Canada. Is Miss McLachlin presiding over any of those cases if they go to appeal?
If they go to appeal, then yes, she may very well, although I note that in recent years they've tried to steer, that is, again, the government, the Chinese regime in China has tried to ensure that those cases are steered away from the non-permanent or foreign members of that court. They get to pick which judges are essentially going to be giving that final judgment. And so, yes, pro-democracy groups, eminent individuals, jurists themselves, activists, lawyers, people like Irwin Cotler have expressed grave concerns over this deterioration of a justice system when you have the communist regime putting its finger on the scales of justice. And that, again, appears to be what's happening. We don't have to look beyond what we saw occur with the two Michaels as one prominent example in recent years, allegations of foreign interference that are happening here in our own country, in our electoral system. These are all blazing red lines and alarms that are going off. And it astounds me, quite
Yeah.
frankly, that Madam Justice McLachlin would turn a blind eye to that and
We
continue
have to go to
to
break,
lend her
Peter.
name to the court.
We have to go to break, but we'll pick that up when we come back. Peter, before the break, you were mentioning Miss McLachlin lending her name and the issues with Canada's relationship with China. Well, you mentioned the two Michaels. There's obviously ongoing issues of foreign interference. Is there a level of naivety here where maybe we are looking at China as a potential partner with rose-colored glasses?
In my opinion, I agree with that assessment. And it's not only Madam Justice McLachlin. Of course, we've seen, I think, a level of that naivety with our own Prime Minister. Certainly, another debacle that played out in Canada involving former Governor General, the Right Honourable David Johnston. I think that there is ample evidence now, concrete evidence, that China doesn't operate with the same values, doesn't operate with any semblance of the type of independence and democracy and respect for human rights that we enjoy here in Canada. One only has to examine their treatment of Tibetans, Uyghurs, certainly Falun Gong practitioners, those who oppose the regime or who speak out, students, academics, rights advocates. This is all very much apparent to anyone who's paying attention. And so to come back to the question, yes, I think there has been a naivety and I think perhaps a hopefulness that just has not transpired.
Yeah, and for the judges who left the Court of Appeal in Hong Kong, who were they and what were their justifications or what were their reasons for removing themselves from that court?
Well, much of it was based on our discussion here. They were from the UK, so they had perhaps a more intimate knowledge of some of the cases that had come before the Court of Final Appeal. They obviously had witnessed their own presence there, in their own presence, what was happening, and did not want to associate their good names with this. These are, for the most part, judges that have retired or are working within a system that is much different than within their own country over time. Again, going back to 1997 when the handover occurred, Hong Kong had been under effective British legal system for almost 100 years. And as soon as that handover occurred, it started to deteriorate. There was, again, a hopeful optimism, but things have not transpired that way. And China, Beijing, have become much, much more aggressive in trying to control the legal system in Hong Kong. So those judges just simply did not want to be a part of that.
Yeah, and I think it likely comes down to whether or not one country, two systems is a principle that is upheld. Where do you think, you mentioned that it began at the transition of power, the handover to mainland China. But is there a point where it crossed the threshold, where being involved in the court was no longer debatable and simply objectionable?
Well, I don't think it can be pinpointed, but there are a number of cases, I would say, over the last 5 years that demonstrate that lack of independence, and the deterioration away from it is accelerating, as witnessed by several of these recent cases that you've referenced and I referenced, including the journalist from the UK. And so I don't think there is any exact moment where it has crystallized, but it has occurred incrementally and accelerated in the last number of years. And so therefore, I think it is incumbent upon judges, Madam Justice McLachlin included, to step away from this system and to speak out against what they must have seen as this deterioration has occurred.
Well, yeah, and it creates a rather uncomfortable possibility in the case of Jimmy Lai. If his case were to go to the final court of appeal, on one hand, Ms. McLachlin could oversee that appeal. Well, on the other, you have our own House of Commons urging for his release and saying that he is more or less a political prisoner. We have about 50 seconds or so here. What do you think is going to happen next, both with Ms. McLachlin and Canada's general relationship with China?
Well, the assessment of those on the ground and following this case closely seem to indicate this is a farcical
Yeah.
kangaroo court type trial, that there will sadly very likely be a conviction. And therefore, as you said, it could go to this final court of appeal, which would, I think, put these judges in a very awkward position, although I suspect that Beijing would steer that appeal away from anyone who might overturn a conviction. And so, for all of those reasons, and for what we have seen over the last number of years,
Yeah.
having lent any credibility to this process, in my view, undermines not only the court itself, but the countries from which these judges originate. And